It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Gavriel Sivan. We're in your beautiful home in Jerusalem. And Gavriel, I've known you for many years. We have a bit of a connection that you spent time in South Africa as well. But it would be so interesting to hear about your background, how you went to South Africa, how you made Aliyah, and about your family and your roots and your illustrious career.
Well, I don't know about the illustrious part, but I mean, I've had a very interesting career with many different aspects to it. So let's start with the family. Two different families, father's side, mother's side, both from Eastern Europe, are very different. My mother's family, who were let's say, who came west first of all, round about 1840, something like that. They lived in a place called Dubžin, which was, or Dobrin in German, which was close to the Prussian border, far northwest Poland. But they were not Polish Jews in many ways, although my ancestor, great-great-grandfather, was a miller, which was perhaps also not a very typical profession for Jews in those days, as milling wheat and so forth, and selling it to the peasants. And all sorts of adventures involved there. I can't go into all the stories that I was told about how once he went out on a trip to neighbouring villages to drum up some trade, and he noticed that as they left the village, the driver didn't cross himself. There was like a crucifix, big crucifix thing. He noticed he didn't cross himself. That was an ominous sign, because Polish Catholic peasants were normally very dutiful about doing this. So he said to him, "Oh, I'm sorry, we've got to go back. I forgot I left my money behind there." And the man said to him, "Just as well, I would have done you in otherwise." That was one story that I was told that went on. There's another story on the other side, which we'll come to. Anyhow, what happened was that although they were not in any immediate danger, but I think that the family felt that they weren't going to be safe living in Poland generation after generation. And so the whole idea was get out, go west. Go west, America, England, France, anyway, like that. And that's what happened, because at a certain stage, it must be 1840s, mid-1840s, so my great-great-grandfather decided that first of all he would take one of his daughters to America, because there was some kind of arrangement with a family with whom there'd been a connection, anyhow. And so she was left in New York, and she never saw the rest of her family again, because in those days people didn't travel. Certainly Jews didn't travel unless they had to. And apparently it broke her heart. According to the stories I've heard, she never really recovered psychologically from being so abandoned, as it were. But she had, I think, a loving husband and a family. And I met some of her descendants years ago when I was in New York. They were members of the Baruch family. Now, the Baruchs were, I suppose you could say, German Jews or German Polish Jews from the south, one of whom had become a surgeon in the Confederate Army in the Civil War. And it was, I think, a son of his who became the famous financier and friend of Presidents Bernard Manus Baruch. So there was a sort of connection there, but a rather distant one. That was the rest of the family stayed in England, and they settled mainly in Liverpool, which was then the second city of the empire, and a good place to do business in, and so forth. The community that was growing, very ambitious, put up most beautiful synagogue in Prince's Road in 1870, whatever it was, 74, something like that. And they were members, or if they were not members of that synagogue, they were members of the rival synagogue at Oak Place, which also put up a fancy shul. And this was before the big immigration from Eastern Europe. Okay, the one that I know most best on that side was Uncle Julius Hyams, who was the head of the family and business and so forth. He was buried in an old Jewish cemetery, which where I knew that the grave existed, behind a wall even, but when I last went back there to try and photograph, it was completely overgrown. You couldn't get at any of the headstones. I don't know what happened. It was a big disappointment. However, my younger brother Vivian had written down what was inscribed on the Matzeva years before, so at least we know what was written there. Anyhow, that's basically it. The family on my mother's side became rather anglicised, although they never abandoned traditional Judaism. It's the interesting things about Anglo Jewry, British Jewry, that unlike the Jews in the United States, the same people came to England and remained traditional. And, but if they moved to the United States, the pressures were such that they would gradually abandon this, that and the other. It's a story that was repeated, and it did not exist north of the Canadian border, the American border, because there was a so-called English tradition there, which was much more conservative with a small c. Anyway, we'll get back to that. Oh, I've told you about my mother's family. Father's family were typical Lithuanian Jews from the Grodno province of Lithuania, the Russian province then was a gubernia, and it was a place called Dyatlova, which in Yiddish became Zettel. And it was interesting, this very small place produced some very famous people, including the Chafetz Chaim and the Dubno Maggid, who were both born, and Dubno Maggid didn't stay there very long, that's why he got the name Dubno Maggid, went to Dublin. But the Chafetz Chaim did live there for some time. And there was just an ordinary Jewish shtetl, you know, with a considerable proportion of the population, such it was. And I'm trying to remember what it was, their business. I don't know. My ancestor, as far as I know, was like a tenant farmer, and he had a piece of land which he cultivated, but basically the family was run by his wife, who kept an inn. And this was not untypical of Jews at that time in Russia. A lot of the country inns were run by Jews, for I don't know what reason, but anyway, that's how it was. And so he was not really the breadwinner. And also he was a Talmud Chacham, and he was more interested in sitting in the Beis Medrash and learning than in sitting outside trying to drum up business for whatever it was. So his wife was really the breadwinner. Not an uncommon story. Anyhow, but what happened was, and this was at the later stage of the 19th century, that there was a fire in the township, and a lot of the buildings were made of wood, and a lot of them were, I don't think there was any great loss of life, but they definitely, it was a push. And my family, on my father's side, decided that they'd had enough, and they were also going to go west. But this was, I'm talking about the early 1890s, not 50, 60 years before. So there, what happened was my great-great-grandfather decided that he would find a match for one of his children, and he proceeded to take her to America again, and he left her there with a boy she barely knew, and then went back home, and they never saw each other again. and so all their brothers and sisters who were in England. In those days, nobody thought of going by ship because it could be expensive, although they didn't lack money. But this is what happened. And she was apparently never recovered psychologically, but we won't go into all of that. But there are descendants, or there were descendants I met. However, the rest of the family stayed in England for a while. They lived in various places like Leeds, Manchester, Glasgow, and my oldest ancestor there decided that England wasn't for them. They were also going to go to New World, but it was going to be America, and it was going to be Canada and not the United States. Anyway, to cut a long story short, the result was that I have a lot of relatives in Toronto, some of whom I've met, and who on the whole are much closer to the English Jewish tradition than they are to the American. In fact, they like to be differentiated from the United States. They're also more Zionistic, as well as being, in many cases, more observative. I've got a cousin who actually is married to a founder of the premier Orthodox synagogue in Toronto, and he himself was brought up in a sort of vaguely ortho-conservative background that opted to become more frum and to be a leader in the community. And he's been here several times with his wife, and I remember we were in touch. The difference is that the members of my mother's family who went across, I saw the last remnants of them years ago on my first visit to the United States. But by the time I was making a second visit, there was no way of contacting them. I think they just disappeared. There was nothing Jewish about them. They were nice people, but they were completely assimilated. And although one, Rosalie, became active in women's Zionist affairs in Rochester, New York, where I was at one stage, but that was it. They had no, I think they had a daughter. What happened to her, I don't know, but by the time I got there, it was left a few matzevot. No trace of anybody living. Okay, so my father's family were in a different category. And they, in England, they were in Leeds, they were in Glasgow, they were in Liverpool. And what happened again, another interesting story, the paterfamilias decided that he'd had enough of England, they were going to go to America, the Golden Medina. And what happened was that they had tickets for a ship that would take them to New York, and from there they intended to go to Toronto, I think. One member of the family stayed behind because he'd met a girl in Liverpool. The girl whom he met, Sarah Borkin, who he eventually married, and he was left behind, and he never saw his brothers and sisters again. Because in those days, you know, the idea of travel over oceans and so forth, it was, anyhow, there were even songs about it. So that was it. So on my mother's side, the family remained Anglicized, but affiliated with Orthodox schools. They had nothing to do with the Reform movement. And my father's family were always Yiddish-speaking traditional Jews, some more from, some less from. And normally there wouldn't be much connection between what they call the Old English and the new the foreign Jews who came in and set up their Stiblach and whatnot, the Smadresh. But as history has worked out very strangely, the Jews of the old Hebrew congregation, the old families have largely disappeared, like the Samuels, but the membership and the leadership of that synagogue, the Prince's Road, passed into the hands of Jews of East European origin. So it's a story in itself. So basically what happened was, my father was the first member of his family, that is on my father's side, the Litvaks, the Dobzhin, the Zetler. He was the first one to go to university. And he had a good head for the classics, eventually won prizes for classical studies at Liverpool University. He wanted to go to Oxford. And that was the ambition, go to Oxford or Cambridge and whatnot. And it would lead to all sorts of things. The headmaster, a man named Whitehouse, whose name originally was Weisser, he was a German immigrant who had become an Anglicized. And he was a bit of an anti-Semite. And he said to my father, apparently, a Jew wouldn't be happy at Oxford. So my father did that. I mean, there was no encouragement to do this. So he stated he went to Liverpool University, and he got a good honours degree, but then what was he going to do? He wanted to become an archaeologist. And I've still got somewhere books of his. This was a passion of his. But it wasn't to be. There was the so-called Ged's Acts of the early 20s where government subsidies for education were cut. So what was he going to do? There was no openings. There was a famous archaeologist, I think, named Glassman, who was professor at Liverpool University, but it didn't help. So he had to fall back on teaching, which he initially hated, he didn't want. And he became a high school teacher. And that was where I came from eventually. All right, well, I think I've gone on long enough about all of this. I'm sure some of it can be cut. But basically, there you have, you see, two East European roots, but they took in different directions, went different directions, both, what you would say, demographically and religiously. And I came into the picture on the 30th of August 1934 at a nursing home in Liverpool, where my father came from these Litvish Jews by origin, and my mother from a semi-Anglicized Anglo-Jewish family of Polish origin. And the interesting thing was that she was known in her own family as the Rebbetzin, because she was much more interested in the do's and don'ts of Judaism. And then the family were all kosher, and they all went to an Orthodox synagogue and so on, but she was much more involved in it. And the funny thing is, at the same time, she was a school athlete. She went to a girls' school, and she won prizes as a short distance runner. Got a picture somewhere of it. And my father was getting older. He was in his late 20s, and he had one or two girlfriends, but nothing serious. And then they met at a Jewish tennis club. That was to lead to them getting married. He was short in stature, so my mother was an inch or two taller. But they tried to disguise that difference, which was not that great anyway. So they got married at the Prince's Road Synagogue in 1931, which was very stylish. Incidentally, my grandfather, his father, had really joined, but he liked going to the Hope Place Synagogue, which is the other Anglicized shul, dressed up in all his finery on a Shabbos, walking across town to sit there and be treated as one of the gentry, so to speak. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, I remember my grandfather, how he looked with his middle age, but I have a photograph of him dressed up, very handsome, very beautifully dressed and stuff. I wouldn't believe it was the same person. It just shows you how people changed as they got older in those days. Anyhow, so that's basically the story, and I came into the picture in August 34, to be followed by my brother Malcolm, Alav Shalom, who passed away a few years ago. in 37. And finally, in 1944, my brother Vivian, who is, thank God, still with us, became a rabbi in London and elsewhere, and is now retired in London. And that's more or less that part of the story. And that's where we came from.
And what is your earliest reminiscence of growing up? What do you recall?
Just before the Second World War, I remember growing up in Liverpool. I had a cousin Harvey, whose parents were by then, no, they weren't in Leeds, they were still in Liverpool. And we were very good friends, real pals. And he was 1 year older than me. He was also 1 year ahead of me in the RAF, except that he was a cook. He had trained in that direction. He was not academic at all, but very nice. And I, of course, had got in an academic direction, and school certificate, GCA, advanced level, and finally I ended up with a state scholarship that took me to Oxford. That's the whole story in itself. I mean, as long as he was alive, we stayed in touch.
Gavriel, your primary school and your schooling, was it at a Jewish school? Or
No.
you went to a government school?
No. The only Jewish school in Liverpool was the Hebrew school, which was in very run-down premises, not far from the high school I attended, St. Pilgrim Street, one end or the other. It was a very dingy place, a bit smelly, partly from the food cooking in the basement that we, who were given by the state meal tickets, that also enabled us to have a kosher meal at the place where it was prepared in Pilgrim Street, in the Hebrew school. The place was very unsavoury. I remember there was a woman named Miss Sleafrig, who used to keep order there, because there were people who came from my school, the institute, from the girls' school, Blackbird House just over the road, and even from more distant places to eat a kosher meal. Because parents in those days were generally more particular about what happened about things like food and meals and whatnot. But we always regarded the places with a certain amount of distaste. And eventually, thanks to more wide-awake attitudes, the whole business of catering for school children was moved to a professional kosher caterer in very close to the Prince's Road Synagogue, Davis's, and there you got a much better meal for the same meal ticket, and so things proceeded. By which time I was already a weekday student at the Liverpool Yeshiva.
But can I ask, your schooling, growing up in the government school, did you have non-Jewish friends, or did you?
Yes. Yes.
And did you ever experience anti-Semitism growing up?
School. Let's see. My time, out of 900 odd boys, about 60 were Jewish, which was a hefty proportion considering the Jews were with 7,000 in a population of about 850,000 was a drop in the ocean. But as usual, the Jews distinguished themselves, and there you are. The headmaster, Mr. J.R. Edwards, a Welshman who was highly Oxfordized. He was an Oxford MA. And when we had assembly in the morning at school, he always appeared in his cap and gown with his Oxford red hood. When I reached a certain stage, I think the fourth one, he automatically put me in the classics stream. My father was a classics teacher. He felt it was going to lead nowhere, and he didn't want me to end up like him, a teacher, by default. So he had a whole row with the headmaster and insisted that I should be put in the modern stream and learn modern languages, not Greek, Latin and ancient history. I mean, I went on with Latin because Latin was the basis of most European languages, but I first took French and later on German. And Mr. Edwards, I don't think he was, I would call him an out-and-out anti-Semite, but he occasionally dropped a remark. I remember there was an awful episode of the British sergeants who were hanged by the Irgun, and this was all in the news, and the headmaster referenced to the morning assembly to the dreadful events taking place in Palestine, but he didn't talk about Jews or anything like that. So he was fair, I would say, in that way, even if he had his own views. We also had one or two Jewish teachers in the school. Mr. Schofield was one, and he was a science teacher, and there was another one named E.S. Conway, who eventually became the headmaster of the Jewish day school, which was both primary and secondary.
What was the name of the school?
The school I attended, the Liverpool Institute High School for Boys. It was a foundation of what they call the merchant princes, the families that had made Liverpool an international centre of trade and so forth. And we had houses, you were put in a house with a name, and that meant in competitions, sports and everything like that. I was in Philip Holt. Because the Holt line was one of the biggest shipping lines, and there were two houses in our school. One was Philip Holt, the other was Alfred Holt. There were others. There was Tate, named after the family, the sugar manufacturers, who also were in Liverpool. And anyway.
And on the Chagim, or Shabbat,
yeah.
Did you have to attend?
No. My father's time, there had been some problems about not getting to school on Shabbat or Chag, more likely. There was a time when there was schooling on Saturday mornings, but eventually it was abandoned. The Jewish boys, normally parents campaigned to keep them off. I don't know all the ins and outs, but I was spared all of that. Always off on Shabbos and Yom Tov. And my headmaster would announce that the Jewish boys were excused the last period in the afternoon so they could get home in time to proceed with their devotions. Also, he had a good relationship with one of the local Jewish ministers, who became Rabbi S.M. Lehrman in London. And he was the minister of the Greenbank Drive Synagogue, and because the Rav of the community was an East European Jew, Zalman Plitnik, who didn't really know how to handle Anglo-Jewish bureaucracy and so forth. So he let Rabbi Dr. Lehrman do it all, and he did it very well. And he used to write letters to the heads of the various schools where there were Jewish pupils, saying that such and such a date will be the festival and so forth, and would you please excuse them not to be attending. So I remember the headmaster always saying, I have had a letter from Dr. Lehrman. So I was not unhappy. I didn't suffer from anti-Semitism at school, except from one school teacher, a Welshman named Morgan, who didn't disguise his anti-Semitism, occasionally told an anti-Jewish joke which made me absolutely hate him. But it was veiled, not too easily expressed. But from the boys I didn't really have anything. There was one episode I remember when I was already in the sixth form, when I overheard in the school library somebody talking about an exclusive club, and we didn't want any Jewish members. And I was furious, and I went round the corner and I said to him, I heard what you said. What do you mean? And I said, yeah. It was very embarrassing because the person he was talking to was not anti-Semitic. And in fact, he went on to get a scholarship to Oxford, and is, as far as I know today, still alive as Lord Oxborough. Just shows you where people could get.
And Gavriel, can I ask your bar mitzvah? Do you have recollections of your bar mitzvah?
You bet. Look, first of all, my mother was very keen on getting me a properly organised Jewish education, and she was the one who engaged a Rebbe, a young man named Kaufman, who used to come 2-3 times a week to improve my Hebrew. And so by the time I was about 6 or 7, I could read Hebrew fluently. And so on to the Talmud Torah and Bar Mitzvah and Liverpool Yeshiva for 3 years. So all that was part and parcel of my education, alongside with my state school education. What else did
the Liverpool Yeshiva, was that part-time?
For me? Oh yes. No, I mean, there were full-time students, one of whom, Ronnie Posner, became interesting. He went to Gateshead. There were several boys who went to Gateshead, which by then had become a premier yeshiva-style institution in England. But in those days, the people who ran the yeshiva were not ultras or fanatics or anything. They were literary Jews who were, for the most part, members of the Mizrahi movement. It's hard to believe it these days. But I became close to one of the younger members of the family, and he told me the whole story about how they had been invaded by Hungarian Jews after the Second World War, came with ultra right-wing views, and that changed the complexion of the institution. Anyhow, so I had no problems that way.
Who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Liverpool Yeshiva?
The original ones I did were before my time. In my time, it was Rabbi Zalman Plitnik, who eventually became the Shtotrav, the rabbi, the communal rabbi. Zalman Plitnik was, actually, it was an interesting story. He and Rabbi Issa Yehuda Unterman, who was to become chief rabbi of Israel, both came from the same part of Lithuania and were both in the Mizrahi movement. Rabbi Unterman was sought out and appointed to become the rabbi of Liverpool. He decided he wanted his old friend to become his deputy. And that is how Rabbi Zalman Plitnik ended up in Liverpool and became the Rosh Yeshiva. Wheels within wheels, but for the good of the community, basically. Can I
just ask, on your bar mitzvah, did you do the whole sidra and the mafta?
No, in those days there was a different tradition. Somebody to read the whole sidra was almost unheard of, even in my East European circles. The standard thing was mafta and haftarah. Haftorah. What happened was that I learned sufficient to not need any coaching. I was able to do the parsha, which was supposed to be in Parshat Ki Teitzei in Devarim. But there was another boy in my class at the Talmud Torah who was not particularly brilliant at Hebrew, to say the least, and he had was it the week before or after me? Anyhow, whatever it was, the headmaster, Mr. Bender, who was an old-timey Hebrew scholar, Zionist, decided that it was a bit risky giving him his parsha, which would have been Parsha Ki Tavo, which was fairly long. So he said to me, "Would you mind? You've got a very short one, Ki Teitzei. Would you mind doing a swap with him? It's not going to make any difference religiously, kind of thing." So I said, I don't mind. As a matter of fact, I took to Parsha Ki Tavo. I liked it. It was from Yeshayahu. Very nice, interesting text. So that was settled. He did the week before, and I did the week later. What happened to him, I've no idea.
And Gabriel, can I ask, what about the war years? What do you recall about?
Oh, that was a different story. Evacuation and all that kind of stuff. Look, we Jews in Liverpool, the family and stuff, were quite very conscious of what was going on under Hitler in Europe. And they probably were despairing of Chamberlain and his lot, who included some people who, if the Germans had come to a final arrangement with the Chamberlain government, we wouldn't be here. Because they would have sacrificed us, the old-style Tory anti-Semites. They would have agreed to Jews being evacuated and so forth. But thank God Churchill was there. Churchill was an entirely different story. And he was the one who insisted we will fight them and the blah, blah, blah. And that's what saved us. My father was in the Home Guard, and members of both my mother's and my father's family were in the armed forces. 3 boys, the Huddersfield boys, their first cousins. Gerald was a medical officer or dental officer. Stanley was in the 51st Highland Division. How that happened to be, I don't know. But he was among the unfortunate ones who were abandoned and captured by the Germans at Saint-Valery, while the rest were rescued at Dunkirk. They were marched across Europe. They went through privations, which I could only imagine. By the end of the war, they were reduced to sucking stones and eating grass. Could you believe it? Some even ate snails. And it had an effect on his health, but he got married and had children, and you are. And Jeffrey got married. Jeffrey was in the army, and he went through Italy, North Africa and Italy. And who else was there? Gerald, I mentioned, he was there. Yeah, so that was the 3 elderly boys. But there were others. My father had a cousin, Jack Gershall, part of the family had moved to Leeds just before the war. And he was in the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve or something like that. Anyway, he became a pilot, not a pilot, he became a rear gunner in the new Lancaster bombers, long-range bombers. He survived 30 operational flights over Germany when the average lifespan of a rear gunner was 5. So he was rewarded he was distinguished for his meritorious service. I've got the testimonial thing somewhere or other. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. Now the interesting is, just quickly, there was class distinction over what medal you got. If you were an officer, you were made a DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross. But if you were one of the other ranks, who was not an officer, but had done the exact same thing, you were given a DFM, Distinguished Flying Medal. And that's what he got. But the joke is that by the time it came for him to go to Buckingham Palace, we got a photograph of him outside Buckingham Palace with his parents and brother. By the time that came, he had already been commissioned as an officer and was sent to India to help with training RAF pilots in the Far East. Anyway, he eventually, after the war, he went back briefly into family business, and then comes 1947, 48, the mandate ends, and so he went out. He was one of the volunteers who went out and helped us create the Israel Air Force. And they wanted him to stay on, but the family said, no, you've got to come back, we need you in the business, or whatever it was. So that was the end of his story. But he was the family hero. 30 operational flights over Nazi Germany, and not shot down or anything like that. It was almost incredible.
And Gavriel, can I ask, did you know, or did your family know what was going on in Europe?
Oh yes.
With the rise of Hitler?
My father was very active in Polit Zion, which was the major Zionist movement in Liverpool. His namesake, Sidney Silverman, who also came from Liverpool, although he was a member of Parliament for Nelson and Colne, and he was his partnership with Manley Livermore continued with it without his active participation. But he was the one who carried the flag for the Sheret HaPleita and for the Zionist movement, civil rights, House of Commons, the one who denounced Bevin to his face in Parliament and so on. Very courageous man. They used to call him the, what was it? The little canary. He had blonde hair, which was very distinctive. But he may have been Silverman, but he was not related to us. He had two sons who were at Oxford in my time, but they were not really involved in Jewish affairs. I don't know what happened to them afterwards. But the parents were both very, very keen Zionists. Anyway, sorry, how did we get onto that?
So can I ask, did your family, when you heard about what was happening in Europe with Hitler, the rise of Hitler,
well, my father was involved in
relatives back in Lithuania, or
there was nothing you personally could do, but you could maybe raise money if there was some cause that they could help them. Basically, you had to hope and pray that things would end before there were no Jews left in Europe.
Was he in touch with the relatives, your mother and your father? Were they their family that remained in Europe? Were they in touch with them? Were they in connection with them?
No, my father, on behalf of his mother, conducted a Yiddish correspondence with somebody who had been part of the family. When they got on, they became merchants of the First Guild. That was a very high position for Jews to attain. But then came the revolution and everything changed, and they lost track. There was one young woman left who actually managed to escape from Soviet Russia to Poland, and she had correspondence with my grandmother. But my father had to, I don't think she wrote, she spoke, but I'm not sure she wrote. So my father used to write the Yiddish letters that were sent to Poland. What happened after that, I have no idea, but I can unfortunately imagine. There was nobody left. But then there was a miracle. Some years ago, there was a thing at Yad Vashem to register members of the family as among the victims. And I supplied all I knew from the books I had, including a memo volume. And then one day, my daughter Shira was already then the head of the Broad Cultural Centre in North Tel Aviv. And the secretary came and said, there was a lady who wants to see you. Who's this? A long-lost relative. She and her husband had been partisans who had gone underground, and they knew they had relatives in the West. But it had taken her some time. But anyway, eventually, when the Iron Curtain lifted, she and her whole family escaped, and they were originally meant to come to Israel, where they already had family. And somehow or other they diverted to America, and that was the tragedy. Because in America, the family assimilated. She was the only one who stayed, close to these things. That's why she came to Israel. Why the contact was made. She was a nice-looking woman. And she supplied me with some family information. But then again, she lost her husband, and she was had her children married out. This is what happened in America. And although I gathered that they were nice people and so forth, but there was, and she was heartbroken. She used to write me letters occasionally, and I once was inadvertently said, "Why didn't you come here?" And said, it was a bad decision that was taken. So that's all I know.
And Gavriel, can I ask, did you in Liverpool? Were there any kinder transport that came to Liverpool? Any of the kinder transport?
Oh yes.
Did they end up in Liverpool?
Oh yes. We knew German Jewish children. There was a brother and sister. What was his first name? She was Hannah, and he was, and didn't know the surname. It'll come back to me. There was also two sisters, different family entirely, who came from Breslau, which is now Wrocław in Poland. And they were very German, very snooty, and very resentful of the fact that they had come down, to be not on a high level. Anyway, one of them married my father's first cousin Jack, who was a lawyer, Helen, and she had a sister whom I visited in Haifa, who'd married his law partner before this law partner made Aliyah. For all I know, the family will be still there. That was the hold on, the name was, I think, Schlesinger. Anyway, but there were also a brother and sister named, no, I got you muddled up. I know, anyway, it doesn't matter. They came from Hanover, not Breslau, Hanover in Germany. Father was a lawyer. Of course, when Hitler came to power, that was the end of the story. So they had to be got out, but they were a bit older than the average. So they were brought, and they ended up in Liverpool. The daughter, Anna, was very resentful of the fact that she was treated, she's probably right, treated as like a sort of poor relation. And after all, her family had been, anyway. And I remember she came with us on holiday to Cleveleys on the Lancashire coast one year, I remember. And she reckoned that she was being used as a sort of poor relation to do odd jobs and so forth. And it was very sad. And I think that we didn't understand sufficiently what, was going through her mind. In the end, I'm sure it was his family. No, I don't think any of her family survived, because the Schlesingers, the ones who were mixed up with the other, there was somebody there who came over to England. Anyhow, but what we knew was my father was part of an underground movement that relayed information that was coming through about what was happening. That's all I knew, but I knew things were going on.
And did you get the reports on the BBC, or was it?
It was all kept under wraps pretty well. I'm not saying deliberately, but the old story about the war effort, everything has to be the war effort, and rescuing Jews in Auschwitz was technically difficult, if not impossible. Whereas bombing a German factory 2 kilometers away was not impossible. That was what was going on. Churchill tried to help. I know that Churchill tried to help, but he encountered problems within probably the bomber command, Bomber Harris. They were not interested in rescuing Jews, they were interested in killing Germans.
And were you evacuated?
Oh yes, in 2 stages actually. Hadn't this been going on long enough? What happened was that by 1939 we could all see what was happening here, the politics, Poland, this and that and the other. And my father joined the Home Guard at a later stage, but being a secondary school teacher, he was in a reserved occupation. So if he wanted, he wouldn't have been able to do much. He eventually became a corporal or sergeant in the Home Guard. Got a photograph of him somewhere, and you remember with his chevrons. But what happened was that there was an underground information thing going on. Sorry, what was
the evacuation?
Oh, the evacuation. So what happened was, the first stage, soon after war broke out, my father's school was evacuated from Liverpool to Holyhead. Now, you probably don't know geographically. If you can imagine a map of England and there's North Wales, like that. The tip of North Wales was a place called Holyhead, which was almost an island, really isolated. To our amazement, when the school arrived there, they found some Jews. Now, I don't think they actually lived in Holyhead, but they'd moved there for one reason or another. It was right opposite Neutral Ireland. And we were only there for about 6 months, and that was the Phony War, and it looked as though nothing much was going to happen.
Was the whole family went?
No, my mother and my brother and I. My father stayed in Liverpool because he was expected to go on teaching or helping whatever they were doing with the evacuation. So after 6 months, it looked as though nothing was happening. So the family were persuaded to move back to Liverpool, just in time for the May Blitz of 1940-41, and that was an experience in itself, because I still have vivid memories. Not everybody alive today went through, remembers going through it. I did. You know, you went to bed at night and you got up in the morning and streets had disappeared around you. People have been killed, not only directly by bombing, but when a bomb exploded and caused water mains to burst. People were drowned by the dozen. These horrors went on for month after month after month. And Liverpool was one of the worst hit. I mean, there was London, and there was Coventry, you know, was the classic thing about the cathedral city and so on. But it didn't have anything like the population, didn't have anything like the casualties and so forth. All right, yeah. Liverpool actually was the centre of what was called Western Approaches. That was the whole underground system of running the convoys from America, bringing supplies and munitions from America before America came into the war officially. So naturally the Germans concentrated on the docks, but some of their bombs went also. It was very easy high up in the air to mistake a place, a residential area close to the docks, and you drop the bomb, and so thousands of people were killed. And as I said, I used to wake up, and I remember waking up in the morning and go out in the street and looking for the street which had disappeared. And yet the thing is, it became natural, you know, you didn't think there was anything unusual, exceptional. So it was part of life. And you know, looking back, I can't imagine, you know, such a situation, but that's what happened. So...
You didn't have bomb shelters where you could...
Yeah, they were death traps, most of them. They built brick shelters from the street level upwards. And you just needed a bit of heavy stuff from an explosion. It would smash the whole place down and kill the people inside. There were underground things. There were things, Anderson shelters, which were like corrugated iron, people used to put in the garden. They would dig down, and it gave some form of protection if you didn't get a direct hit. Mostly people who weren't them did survive. But as I say, there was also the underground shelters, and unfortunately things like that happened. Anyway, but then I remember going to shul with my father during the blackout, during the 41 Blitz. Going to shul to hear the Megillah read. Can you believe it?
And were any of your friends or any Jewish institutions hit by the bombs?
Jews were hit?
No, any Jewish institutions.
Oh, yes, of course. There were downtown. There were all the foreign shuls, bar one, were downtown, and they were in the areas that were devastated. There were a couple. I remember the one that my parents' father's family belonged to, Shore Street. That was destroyed or nearly destroyed, and it was like Stiebler. But some survived. I remember there's still Crown Street, Grove Street shuls existed when I was at school. I never went inside. My father's aunt Bessie was married to a Lubavitcher Chassid. Interesting, Uncle Zalman. Now he was a real sort of rare avis, you know, a rare bird, because there were no other Hasidim with the family. And he was very smart. He always dressed in a tailcoat. He was a tailor. Tailcoat and special tie and so forth. He was very smart. He was a master tailor, and he made my first overcoat. Do you know, it was such a good coat, it went from generation to generation, that coat, I remember, without showing any marks at all. Anyhow, how did I get on to Uncle Zalman? Oh yes. So he was a member of I think the Crown Street, there was a shul, the Nusach Ari, it was called, Nusach Ari. And that was a Hasidic shtibel of some sort. And I remember they used to say that Uncle Zalman became a Chassid on Simchas Torah when he used to dance. Where he danced, I don't know anyway. However, despite the fact he was a master tailor and he had bought a wonderful big house in its own grounds, Olive Lane, and his children all became very active Zionists and all kinds of stuff. But he was very mean. I remember we used to go there sometimes on a Sunday, like the poor relations would go to Uncle Zalman and Auntie Bessie. Auntie Bessie was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother's sister. And as I say, they lived in a big house, and they used to have, sometimes on Motzei Shabbat, they used to have card parties. They used to play cards and have I didn't get drunk, but they had a glass of this, that and the other. Don't remember all the details. While we kids had a playroom in which there were toy trains and stuff like that. And there was a big garden, and we used to also play when the weather was good. But we were warned that Jack Yaffe, the son, who became a lawyer, he had a law partner, and they took two German refugee girls, and they got married. Each one married one of the sisters. Oh. And these are the ones I referred to before, the ones who came from Breslau. And Helen was very good looking, from I remember. She was like, what was the name of that Swedish actress? Do you know what I'm talking about? Famous Swedish actress. Anyway, she was blonde, beautiful features and so forth. And she had a sister who was almost as good looking. She married the law partner, and they were, I visited them in Haifa. They were Zionists, but were not terribly Jewish. Anyway, and that went for Jack as well. He used to tell stories. I remember my brother was once astonished. A family simcha, he found his way to the WC where he needed it, and Jack Yaffe was there ahead of him, and he turned to him and he said, "Do you often frequent the pissoir?" My brother didn't know what the hell he was talking about, so I explained the pissoir meant a urinal. He very affected. He had an affected so-called Oxford accent. Of course, he never went near the place. But
and Gavriel, during the war years, with food rationing, do you remember being hungry, or did you have enough food?
No. First of all, soon after our second evacuation, we ended up in Cleveley's. That's a story in itself. Cleveley's was a small village, little more than a village, between Blackpool and Fleetwood on the Lancashire coast, facing the Irish Sea. It was very tranquil. It had a very interesting population, of some of whom came originally from Liverpool or other parts of Lancashire or the north. But it had a community of its own. It had its own cinema, run by Mr. Gribble, whose children I was friendly with. When we got there, we thought we were the only Jews, because my parents had gone there for holidays before the war, which is why they chose. They knew it was a nice place. The people were nice people. They made an arrangement with a widow lady that who had a large house, that she would give us part of the house to live in and cook and so forth. And she had a son-in-law, Mr. Chisholm, whose son was a bit older than me, but also at school, also in Liverpool. So there was a link there. And so my mother was able to cash a part of her kitchen, and that's where she did the cooking for us. And my grandmother in Liverpool, who never moved, used to send us each week a parcel of kosher meat by train, which was picked up and brought there and salted and dealt with it and so forth. So that was it. There was rationing. The interesting thing is, you had a ration book, every adult, and you had like coupons inside for meat, for milk, yes, probably milk, and all kinds of other things, bacon included. So my parents used to exchange the non-kosher coupons for something else, so they have an extra cheese supply or something. It wasn't always strictly kosher, but you had to survive. What was I going to say about
There was a little Jewish community?
Yeah, no, when we got there, we didn't know of any Jews. I don't think they'd known any there living there in holiday before the war. But a few months later, all of a sudden, deluge. A whole community came from Manchester, led by a Mr. Grosskopf, whose family became quite well known. A young man, and he was like the Cheder teacher, the headmaster, the organizer, and he certainly got organized because, first of all, they were all given farm accommodation, as we had been, and secondly, he organized a kehillah. There was a church hall over the road from where we were living at the stage. He arranged that they used the church hall on Sundays, but during the week and on Saturdays, they were happy to turn it over to us as a shul and a school. So we never expected that a whole kehillah would be established. One of the girls I remember was Maureen Adler, who was about my age, was a member of the Chief Rabbi Adler's family. And it was very interesting. And there were people of my age and so on. So there was a whole community, and a communal life was set up in this remarkably undistinguished place. And there we stayed for about 2.5 years before we went back to Liverpool when the war was already, well advanced. Nazis were in full retreat. I remember once a German plane flying over the Irish Sea near us, but we were not on target, and I don't know, the pilot just disappeared, fortunately. Trying to think what else to tell you about the evacuation. No, the non-Jewish population were wonderful. The fact that we were Jewish mattered less than the fact that we were evacuees. They took us in, they helped us find accommodation and schooling and everything, shopping, where to shop, where to go. There was also a concert party. It was unbelievable. Right before the beach, there was a kind of semicircle behind which there were changing rooms. And there was this concert party, Charlie Parsons and co. And he was the comic turn, and there was a nice looking girl who was one of the singers. There was a Belgian refugee violinist, and they used to have talent competitions for children. My mother was always very ambitious for me, so one occasion they asked for people to step forward. I didn't want it. And she pushed me onto the stage and said, sing Waltzing Matilda. Because someone, so Waltzing Matilda. I got first prize, which is a box of chocolates. But you know, they were happy years, and we made friends. And a few years ago, when Pinchas, our eldest boy, and I were on a tour of places of interest in England, family history and so forth, we also spent half a day in Cleves, tried to find a house where we lived, and I made a mistake about the number, but eventually we found a place which had been that of Mrs. whoever the name was, I've forgotten. We also discovered that there were Jews living there. We didn't know that there had been a few scattered Jewish families living in the area, where they were evacuated, more likely business. But nothing happened communally wise until the Manchester Jews arrived. And they stayed until maybe 1944 or something like that before they went back, when the threat of the bombing had receded.
And going back to Liverpool, your home still remained? It wasn't bombed? You could go back to your home?
No, we were lucky. I mean, as I say, the streets disappeared, but our street was not hit. It was just a matter of luck. I went back long after we left Liverpool, and the family moved to Ilford, and then later on to Israel. I went back, and I can hardly remember the place. First of all, the railings in the front that had been there originally had all been taken away for the war effort, to be melted down. The front door had changed colour. The place looked very third rate. I mean, to me, the house was a house. It was a multi-storey, Victorian building. Very solidly built.
Was it in the Jewish area?
Yes, well, there's a whole community.
And today, is there still a Jewish area?
No. There are no Jews left there. They all moved to another area called Childwall, which in itself is also in decline. Now look, in my time there were maybe 8,000-9,000 Jews on Merseyside, with a number of schools and institutions and so forth. When we went back, there were barely, 2.5 schools, and no yeshiva, no Talmud Torah, and there was a King David school, which is supposedly a Jewish day school, but 90% of the kids were not Jewish.
And what is the population today of Liverpool, the Jewish population?
It's down to about 2,000 plus. At its peak, around about the First World War, it was over 11,000. And it was a major community. It had been surpassed by Manchester and Leeds and Glasgow. But for generations, it was the second city of the empire, and also the second city of the Jewish community, because more important people were born and brought up there, the Samuel family, for example, and the famous Bertram Venus, the chancery lawyer and Jewish historian, and even today there are people. A boy who was at school with me, Bernard Wolfson, whose father was a minister. Bernard's son is now Lord Wolfson. He's, I think, a law lord or something like that.
And Gavriel, can I ask, do you recall or do you remember ever meeting Rabbi Schoenfeld during the war or the evacuation?
Not during the war. Years later, when I was already a graduate student, I was friendly with people who belonged to a certain youth organisation who was a bit to the right of where I was. And I remember I was invited to maybe an engagement party or something like that. And Solomon Schoenfeld was there. And you remember his father was the one that gave the name to the Avigdor schools, Victor Schoenfeld. And he had been one of the founding lights of the Mizrahi movement in England, till he became principal in Palestine, had a bus stop over policy or something, anyway, and that changed everything. I remember Solomon Schonfeld joking with somebody or other, saying, I don't know, I just remember some remark he made, it was not important.
And did you belong to a youth movement when you were growing up?
Yeah, well, that was the whole thing. You see, my parents didn't want me to join Habonim. They regarded it as being very secular. Although they weren't social frugal, but they didn't. My mother was more consciously Jewish than my father, although her background was more Anglicized. She was known as the Rebbitzin in the family. But she was the one who kept the standards even more than my father. I'm sorry, what were we saying?
Did you belong to a youth?
Oh, yes. So in my time, the youth movement was Habonim.
And Bnei Akiva?
Bnei Akiva was created later, but I got involved in an intermediate stage when there was an older boy who ran what was supposed to be Bnei Akiva. It was just like a Jewish youth club. It wasn't not very interesting, and I was too young to be interested in the girls. So after a few months, I stopped going, and I never had any more to do with it until years later, when I was already grown up and in the forces and then at university. Then I became more involved in Jewish things. But partly this was, I suppose, something I carried over from my parents. When I was in the forces, I think I was one of 3 people in the RAF who kept kosher. Many of the others, boys that I knew, came from traditional homes, but they hadn't been told that you had to make sacrifices or that this was important. So, in some cases, even some Anglicized ministers said to them, well, you can't help it, you have to do all this stuff. I was instructed here, don't take any notice of those things. You did. So I fought, when I was doing square bashing, I was fought about a kosher diet. So I was arranged to see the catering officer, who was a Roman Catholic, who was not unfriendly, and explain what the situation was, and I wanted to know if I could have an alternative diet. And he said, well, I'm a Roman Catholic. And I don't, I'm not supposed to eat meat on a Friday. But because I'm in the job, I'm never blah, 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 blah. But because I have dispensation for this. And I remember saying to him, sir, there is no dispensation in my religion. I don't have the chutzpah to say. He was so taken aback, he arranged for me to have an alternative. Extra cheese, extra this, that and the other. Didn't really make that much, but it was only a six-week period anyway. After that, gradually thinking, by the time we were in Germany, I could exist on the food without infringing kashrut, because there was a buffet that was set out as where I was in Germany, as well as being the hot stuff that was served. They had canned tuna and this and that and the other, and hard-boiled eggs and stuff. You could survive on that. And then also, there was a strictly vegetarian restaurant in Hamburg where I could go and have a very good meal.
And what year was it that you went to Germany? What year were you?
Let me see now. I was in 53, 55. It would have been 54.
54. And Gavriel, can I just ask, in 1948, do you remember in 47 the partition plan?
No, I don't think I remember that specifically.
Or the creation of the State of Israel?
Very vaguely. And it's strange really, because I've got such a vivid memory about other things. I mean, look, my family were very involved. My mother was involved as a member of, supposedly with Wheatso then. My father, because he was in Polit Zion. And Polit Zion was the most active Zionist movement in Liverpool. And it had, its flagship person was Sidney Silverman, the MP. and I don't know. Look, I know there were a lot of underground activities. I don't have details. I don't remember. I was too young anyway. But I mean, the fact that I was conscious of something going on, yes, I was.
But the creation of the state, when
I don't remember. I don't remember specifically what happened. You know, at the time. What I do remember is during the late mandate period, the two sergeants. Do you remember the story? Two British sergeants who had been taken by the, I think the Irgun as hostages in order to release, what's his name? There was somebody who was an underground fighter. Dov Gruner?
Dov Gruner.
Yeah.
It was Dov Gruner, yeah.
Anyway, and the British went back on it anyway, and so they hanged the sergeant.
Because they executed Dov Gruner.
And it turned out afterwards that one of them was Jewish.
Oy.
How this was overlooked, I don't know. But I mean, he was technically Jewish. He wasn't practicing, but he was Jewish.
And the bombing of the King David Hotel?
No, I don't remember anything about it. I mean, I know it happened, but I don't remember. I wasn't there. Look, there was a lot of stuff in the papers. There was a certain atmosphere, anti-Semitic atmosphere, for a time. Liverpool suffered less than the other major cities. I mean, a few windows were broken, but I never. I mean, although we were undisguisedly Jewish, apart from one odd remark by the headmaster, which did not directly talk about Jews, about terrorism. I didn't really feel that much. I mean, I must say that I had non-Jewish friends and nothing bothered them. They didn't associate me with terrorism or anything like that.
And Gavriel, when the state was formed, when it was established, did you have Zionistic feelings that you wanted to go make Aliyah?
No, not at that time.
What at that time?
No, we felt like a sort of patriotic duty to support Israel, and join the Zionist youth movement, and raise money. I remember we had what was called the Jewish room during prayers during the assembly in the morning. There was a room in which all the Jewish boys were gathered. Now we had a prefect, I don't know whether it exists in South Africa, named Henry Lax, who became a judge and also very active in the Mizrahi and so forth in Liverpool. Henry Lax was our prefect, and he conducted prayers in the morning. Not a teacher, a prefect, because he was tall, he was very authoritative, and we all looked up to him. Although he had a slightly Germanic accent, because his father was a Dayan from somewhere in, I think, must have been Silesia or somewhere, anywhere like that in Eastern Europe. But while, amusing actually, while the boys were singing Onward Christian Soldiers and so forth downstairs, we were collecting money for the JNF. Yes, yeah. And how do you do it? We had stamps. Each stamp was worth a penny or something like that. So if you had extra money in your pocket, and the stamps were stuck on a place on a picture, eventually it all formed one scene. These are ways the JNF used to raise money, by teaching the children to get used to it.
There was a JNF book, I remember, with the stamps. I remember.
Yeah, you
did as well. And Gavriel, where did you study after school? Where did you go? Where did your higher education?
I see. Well, I think I mentioned that. I mean, I had a school certificate. That was like matriculation. Higher certificate. That was for university entrance. And I came through after school certificate. I had one subject I failed in. I think I told you, maths, because the headmaster, because the teacher was bloody anti-Semite, and he never taught me anything. But because I got a credit in the same category in general science, that saved me. after that, could never bother thinking about. I mean, I used a calculator, this, that, the other, but when it came to things like trigonometry, I was not interested. Anyway, but I got good results, and as a result, after taking the A-levels higher certificate, I was awarded a senior city scholarship. That entitled me to go to Liverpool University as a non-fee payer. However, shortly afterwards, it was announced that I had also been selected as a state scholar. That means I got a state scholarship, which was worth a great deal more and entitled me to be admitted to any university where there was a place available. So I then sat for Oxford. I never interested in Cambridge, although I think I did do one out of interest one thing, but Oxford was aimed for. So I went and sat for the examination for the entrance examination at Oxford was divided into groups of colleges. You know, Liverpool, Oxford and Cambridge are made up of colleges. So my college, Oriel, was the top of the list. I still remember it was Oriel, the Queen's, and Brasenose College, Christ Church, Trinity, and St John's. That was the group. Oriel was the college I was interested in. First of all, the name intrigued me. It sounded vaguely Hebraic, you know. It had nothing to do with Uriel. It had to do with the aureole, which was a kind of window in Norman French. Anyway, never mind. However, the college had a very interesting history, and I memorized all kinds of rare facts. So when I went up, I reckon that most of those people, whether they were public school boys or grammar school boys, they were much of a muchness. There might have been one or two, but you know, more exceptional. Anyway, so I reckon that I had as good a chance of any of getting in, but I would look up my college history. So when the people were normally they were interviewed, and 5, 6, 7 minutes, one's in, one's out. So I was admitted. What makes you wanting to join the college? Well, the college history is just, you know, I was interested in the man who wrote the natural history of Selborne, and also there was Cecil Rhodes and his Empire Building. It was one of the old boys who left enough money to build a whole wing of the college. I bet you didn't know that about Cecil Rhodes. And and Sir Walter Raleigh was there. A man whom I admired. I mean, he was the victim of his time, but he was a great man, Raleigh, and Gilbert White, and all kinds of people. So I was talking about it. They let me talk. It went on and on. They asked me other questions and so forth. Finally said, "Well, thank you. You'll be hearing from us." And sure enough, I got that to say I've been admitted. You know, it's just I had the presence of mind to do something different from the others.
And what did you study when you were at Oxford?
When did I?
No, what did you study?
Oh, what? Modern languages, French and German. I had done Latin up to A level, but it was useful when it came to dealing with philology, you know, the origin of words and so forth, the link between Latin and French, for example. Not so much German. But as I explained, because my father insisted I did not condemn myself to death with classics.
And Gavriel, did you speak Yiddish at home?
No.
Did you understand Yiddish?
Look, my brothers and I, learnt to understand certain basic things. That's part of the adult secret code, you know. Yeah, where's the schlüssel and that kind of thing. But no, we didn't speak Yiddish at home. Later on, it was much later on, I became interested in Yiddish And in fact, I started to get English grammar, English Yiddish dictionary and so forth. And I listened, also there was Yiddish music, Yiddish songs, all of which still interest me.
And you graduated at Oxford?
Yes, I graduated, hold on. I went up 53, 55 years, 55. So 55 I started at Oxford and graduated in 58. Had a good time at Oxford. And made a lot of friends.
You never had anti-Semitism at Oxford, or?
No.
And people knew you were Jewish?
Yes, but I had one of my best friends was a Muslim Indian whose father had been at the college before him. Can you believe that? There was a type of Anglo-Indian who was so Europeanized. So his son should also go to the college he'd attended. And we were very good friends. He came to Zionist meetings with me sometimes. Just shows you see, that not all Muslims. Oh, he was very punctilious. He would not eat the food in the college apart from breakfast because he kept halal. How many were so strict as he was, I don't know. But I lost touch with him. I tried to get in touch with him years later, but never got an answer. So what happened, I don't know.
And then after you got your degree?
No anti-Semitism. There was not even from the Arabs, a few people that I met.
Were there other Jewish students in Oxford with you?
Lots. We reckoned in my time there were a few hundred, but not all of them joined the Jewish Student Society, maybe 50-60%. And not all of them came to all the meetings. But we ran a kosher canteen for weekdays and Shabbat and Chag, it was turn time. And we had an Irish lady who did the cooking under supervision. And I was a meals thingy, but I didn't take part in the meals itself. I was on the financial side organising it. But I also was the Shabbos for one term, organising the Aliyot and Shabbat. We had our shul, which was part of the building in which the the refectory was, where the meals were served. And so I because of my background, so I was suitable to take a job like being Shabbos. And I enjoyed it.
And
we also had the Zionist Society, which was separate, the Israel group.
And Gavriel, when did you join the RAF?
Oh, that was in 53. When I left, what happened was, after I got notification that I was being admitted to Oriel as a commoner, I had a choice. Should I stay at school, or should I go out and maybe try and look for a job until I got my call up? Because I had my medical and I was A1. So very foolishly I stayed in school. I should have gone out and done something else. But and then eventually, what was end of August, beginning of September of 53, I got my call-up papers and told, here we are, the train ticket, you have to go to a place called Hennesford in Staffordshire. There's a train that takes you there, and bring a small suitcase with change of clothing, and you'll get other things when you go. So that's how it started. And I get there, and eventually, you find the other Jews in unsuspected places. There was a clerk where I was for a time, who was from Manchester and was very frum, and he took care never to leave England or get involved in anything. How he managed it, I don't know. Anyway, that's his business. I met him later. He went on to Cambridge, and we had an interfunction, Oxford and Cambridge Jewish Societies, and it was years later I met him in different circumstances. We also had at Hannahsford, where I was doing the basic training, we had a shul. The officer commanding whatever he was had decided that all the Jewish recruits should be given certain facilities in one place, not scattered around in this place called Hannahsford. He had a shul built, and we were allowed not to attend the parade on a Saturday morning so that we could attend services. And when the official notification came through that it was going to be Pesach or Shavuos or something like that, we were given time off if it was needed from the course. They were very considerate, I must say. Not every army, I think, did that, even in the Americans. So I remember on the last day before we sort of graduated from the course, there was the passing out parade. So I organised the service. I made sure it was long enough for us to miss the parade. Not that I didn't have many accomplices, but anyway.
And
the Jewish boys generally hated my regimentation. Yeah.
Well, what did you do in the RAF? What was your position?
What was my position? Well, first of all, I did the basic training. And then after that, there was, towards the end of that period, 6 weeks, we were interviewed. You could be interviewed to see whether it was suitable to be an officer cadet. Officer cadet meant that you would have wear your general cap, but there'd be a white band round it here to indicate that you were on the way, you see. And I thought to myself, well, it might be a very good joke, I'll put it. Of course, the next one I didn't get. The officer said to me, why do you want to join? I said, oh, what are you going to do? I said, I thought maybe liaison work with the Americans. Oh, stupid. But anyway, it was a good lot. But then, in fact, what happened was that this was in the middle of the Russian course. Was it?
This is 50.
No, I can't remember whether.
54, 50.
Yes, no. I'm trying to remember whether the selection for the officers cadet selection was before that. Only one person was selected for the OTC. The rest of us, whatever we chose, most of us, the group I belonged to, had all been to high school, all had some qualifications, even a bit of foreign languages. And that's how I applied myself. I was selected for the Russian course. And a great thing. I mean, the people, one or two, no, that's right. The first thing was just he was taken off the square bashing and sent into the officer cadets thing. The second thing was, while we were on the Russian course, there was an examination which took place while I was away on Yom Kippur. And when I came back, I got, in the final exam, I had 73%, and they took everyone for 74%. At the time, I thought, oh, that was not fair. But actually, we came out very well, because the people who did the course, which was at Cambridge, had to work very hard. They had to learn so many words a day, a week, and they didn't have much time to themselves. And I don't know how many of them survived the thing to become officers. You know, that was the thing. Oh, well, you become a pilot officer and so forth. So what? It didn't get anywhere, because soon afterwards national service was abandoned. So you were left with your uniform. Whereas we had been sent either to Iraq or to Germany. A friend of mine, Ken Zucker, went to Iraq, but I was sent with most other Jewish personnel, not by chance, to Germany. And we had a great time. We worked. We were on a 48-hour one-on, one-off shift of so many hours at a time, listening to Soviet bloc aircraft and writing down or recording what we heard. Now, obviously, I couldn't be a Shomer Shabbat doing this, but then I thought to myself, listen, what I'm doing in a way is also a mitzvah, I think, working against the Russians. So, and then you did 48 hours on, and then you had 48 hours off. That 48 hours I went to Hamburg. There was a vegetarian restaurant there which was very dependable. There was a shul which I could go to. There were a few communal events. So, and you could go around and you could save up enough money to go buy a good watch or a camera or something like that. We also had free entertainment provided by the forces. We had La Scala Milan came and gave a performance of one of the Verdi operas. There were cinemas that showed also. They had all the latest Hollywood British films, but they also had German films, very interesting ones from an anti-Nazi point of view. Hamburg, which was a city near where we were, was a bastion of social democracy. It's always been a left-wing city. And what's his name had been the guy who became Chancellor. What's his name? Brandt, Willy Brandt.
Willy Brandt, yeah.
Yeah, he was from Hamburg.
He actually apologized for... Willy Brandt publicly apologized.
Yes, no. But look at that. He had left Germany, gone to Norway, joined the Norwegian resistance to fight his own people.
Was it difficult going back to Germany, going to Germany after the Shoah, after the Holocaust?
Well, I suppose initially I didn't relish it. But first of all, not everybody you meet on the street is a Nazi. A lot of them were very apologetic and wanted to show that they were not connected. Look, whether or no, I don't know. But the point is that out of 60 million people, you can't expect them all be goose-stepping, Hitlering people. Look, the worst you could say is they fell in line. But that doesn't mean to say they would give somebody away. And many people, more than in some of the so-called occupied countries, hate Jews during the war.
Yeah.
And I met people in that category.
And the synagogue, was it original synagogue that you went to? Or was it...
No, it was actually not a real shul at all. It was a large room in part of communal headquarters. And it was arranged so that the chazan, who was like the rabbi, sat on one side, and then there were rows of seats after that. Who went to it? It was really very sad. There were no children because they had to go to school. So there were middle-aged to elderly people, some of whom you, even some of you, whom goodness knows what. And the Reverend Singer, as his name was, he ran the services and he organised this Suda Shlishit on the Friday.
Were there survivors in the shul?
Were there what?
Holocaust survivors in the shul?
I'm sure there were. Now the caretaker of the place with whom he became friendly, he and his family, they had survived underground. They had non-Jewish neighbours who hid them and fed them during the war. So he came up Hardy, and he was immediately given the job as being the shamus for the community, such as it was. But the thing is, what was the community then? There were maybe a dozen families that were still really Jewish. The rest were all products of mixed marriages and goodness knows what. And they used to have events. There was a building that belonged to the Nordwestdeutsche Rundfunk. That was the Hamburg broadcasting station. And they had a beautiful new building which had once been the liberal synagogue. So what did they do? They didn't hand it back, but they arranged that on certain key dates the building would be at the disposal of the Jewish community for Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Chanukah, Purim. I went to a Purim celebration, I remember, and they had a concert, and there were all these chubby little German kids singing and so on. A big joke. No, I held it against it. And they did what they thought was the right thing by the Jews who were living there. There was some restitution and whatnot. Then I was more interested in the past than in the present.
And how long did you stay in Hamburg, in Germany?
No, we were there from, I think it was November to August, but he wasn't in Hamburg the whole time. In fact, he wasn't in Hamburg at all, because where we were based was way outside, miles inland, in Schleswig-Holstein, a place called Uetersen, which had been German Herding's officer cadet training establishment, which is why it was nothing like an RAF camp. Well, Nissen huts and all that. They were brick buildings, centrally heated. You were 2 or 3 to a room. You were not in barracks or anything like that. You had German orderlies who cleaned the room for you, who did the mending for you, if you needed it. It was almost a life of Riley, I mean, we were treated like goodness knows what. And as I say, the food was very different. I mean, I could make a good meal almost any time from what was available. We were there most of the time in Uetersen, and there was a cinema nearby, but we mainly went to see the films in Hamburg that were very interesting. The German films were all about the Nazi period, and they were very interesting. I mean, in some ways they were better than the films produced by the Western period, because they showed really what was going on. I don't know, I went to see the house in which the uncle of Heinrich Heine, the great poet, had created a Jewish hospital. It was interesting. I wrote an article about that appeared in the Forces magazine, Menorah. But eventually then we moved. The last month or two there, we were shifted around. They were changing bases. I didn't know what was going on exactly. And till the day I got my call up to go the other way. And I remember we crossed. It was so funny. I was in the RAF, but I never set foot in a plane. Every RAF camp, there was a World War II Spitfire or Hurricane at the entrance, sort of tethered to the ground. But that was as far as it went. I didn't fly until years later. And what was it? Oh yes. So when my period in Germany came to an end, I got orders to take a plane ticket, train ticket, then a ship across, and then by train to London, and from London to a place in the West Country where I would get my discharge. And I was stuck there for 2 or 3 days, waiting for. You could keep certain items of uniform according to what you could keep your shirts if you wanted. You could keep underwear, socks, shoes or boots, and so on. So I picked my best uniform, which was the smartest one, with the shiny things, anodized buttons. Shoes are not boots. Can't remember whether I bothered with socks, but the underwear was okay. And then you lined up, they called your name, you saluted, and you saluted in return, and handed the packet with your last pay, you see. only this time it was in pounds sterling, not in tokens which you got in Germany, which you could exchange. But and then on the train back to Liverpool, and that was that. I had one period of reserve trading the following year in a place called Withall near Birmingham, and we had a sergeant instructor who was in charge of everything, and I was a bit nervous about getting home for Shabbos because I had noticed. So I went up to this sergeant and I said, "Excuse me," he said, "but I'm an observant Jew and I would like to be able to get home in time for the Sabbath. Can you tell me if I will be able to do so?" And he turned around and said to me, "Shabbos begins at such and such a time in Birmingham." He was from. Later we became great friends. He came in Aliyah, became head of some dental unit or something or other in the Mitzrah. He's still alive in Moshe Kelman.
I know Moshe Kelman.
Oh, you know. So now you know part of his history when he was a sergeant instructor in the RAF. And I was a prize pupil. Yeah. Is Rose still around?
I saw them together, but it was a while ago.
Oh. Is he all right? Good. Yeah, anyway, so that was it. I did one period of reserve duty, and after that, no more.
And then you moved, then you went to Oxford.
Yeah, well, I mean, the following, we were discharged at the end of August, say October. I landed up in Oxford. I think it was Chol Hamoed Sukkot or something or other when I got there. Finding your feet. 3 years at Oxford. Of course, that was part of my growing up. I mean, the forces, I got into the forces as a boy. But because of your experiences and this and that and the other, you grow up. I also put on weight and height. I was about 5'4" when I went in. I came out about 5'8.5". I think I've shrunk since then. But no, I think it was great. I do not regret a moment of the fact that I did national service. It was a challenge, an experience, and an education. I think that it would have been most of the nice Jewish boys find ways of getting out. They claimed to be yeshiva bachrim, which was often a lie, or some other thing, or they faked an ailment, and I didn't have any time for such people. They wouldn't do it in Israel. They wouldn't get away with trying to do it. So that was it. I thought, you are on the right side of the Cold War. You're going to be on the Russian side. That was a joke, actually. Years later, I was doing Miluim, and I was in a tent with one of the first Russian Jews to get out, youngish man, about my age, or maybe slightly older. And we got talking. My Russian was better than it is now. And I explained to him how I came to be speaking Russian, what I'd done, what I'd trained and stuff. He looked at me and then he laughed. He said, "I was doing the same thing on the other side."
Amazing. It's incredible.
Yeah. I've forgotten his name, but he was very genuine. He got a top job in his scientific field in America. But he insisted on staying in Israel and doing his national service as his form of contribution. Yeah. Well, we haven't got very far with this story, have we?
It's incredible. It's riveting. What an amazing story.
Yeah, well, there's a lot more to come. But anyway, what time is it?
Maybe we'll take. I just want to, in the meantime, I just want to thank you because this will be our first part. So, Gavriel, this has been really unbelievable.
Well, I was hoping that being off the cuff would be better.
It's
speaking to a script.
Gavriel, I am so grateful to you. And we'll continue and the second part. But this, what you achieved and what you went through It's really quite unbelievable.
Oh, I don't know.
And it's
to me, it's
modern Jewish history. It's really amazing.
That's true, because I lived part of Jewish history.
You really did. You witnessed what you went through, and your parents, and growing up and going to the RAF and being accepted at Oxford. It's incredible. It really is.
Well,
it's remarkable.
I don't know all of it is so incredible, but look, it's all part of one interesting picture. I admit that it's interesting, because many people, they never do anything much interesting, of interest in life. They get through it, they have a job, they don't get bothered with hobbies, they don't have many friends.
You've met such amazing people in your career and your...
That came later. I mean, the people that I met. Hold on. One of the people I didn't mention, who was on the naval side of the Russian course, was somebody called Jack Rosenthal. Does the name mean anything to you? He became a BBC playwright.
Wow.
Two of his plays, I've got a whole collection of them on disc. One was called The Evacuees, which reproduced our experiences. He was a Mancunian, very Jewish. I don't know how from, but he was very Jewish. And he put his experiences as an evacuee into the whole story about these two little boys who were plonked down somewhere, goodness knows where, and what happens to them, and how they survive it all. And the other one was called The Bar Mitzvah Boy. And this is about how